So, good evening. Welcome to Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy. Today is Tuesday, March 4th, 2025, and this is the City University of New York, Medgar Evers College. My name is Felix Obi, and I am, of course, your instructor for the class. Last week, we began a three-part study of the three theoretical perspectives of global trade. Again, the three major perspectives include liberal, realistic, and historical materialism. And our discussion last week centered on the liberal perspective. This week, we will discuss the realistic perspective. Realism emphasizes power and the national interest and directs more attention to political security than economic issues. This may ring familiar if any one of you have been paying attention to the news lately. First, realism is the oldest school of thought in international relations, otherwise known as IR industry. Second, classical realism was the dominant approach to international relations for a very long time. Third, realism is an important international political economy perspective today because of the debates about the decline of U.S. economic hegemony vis-a-vis emerging powers such as China, and about the relative merits of government involvement in the markets. These issues have become more pressing since the ongoing heightened debate on tariffs. And more recently, government involvement in markets is also the foundation of debate over geopolitical competition and some countries' reliance on non-market economic practices when international trading partners determine that a country does not operate on market principles of cost and pricing structures. When this happens, sale of merchandise from such a country do not reflect the fair value of the merchandise. As such, state subsidies, especially on export products, causes a misalignment between price and production cost in the global economy. And this impairs the efficient operation of the free market system. Now, as I hope everyone in the class would have heard by now, and I am going to try to wrap up today's lecture and hopefully office hour in time to allow all to watch the president's address to the joint session of Congress. But getting back on track, President Trump announced an increase in tariffs against China. It is fair to mention that the United States is not the only jurisdiction that has imposed tariffs on China's exports due to non-market economic practice, especially import of the electric cars. I should note that the European Union has instituted similar measure, that Canada has instituted similar measure, and indeed, China's fellow BRICS member country, Brazil, I understand is also implementing trade barriers against China. And I believe part of that is also tariff on Chinese electric cars. So I go to this detail about the tariffs against China from different jurisdictions to try to draw a distinction between those tariffs, or at least the United States government stated policy objectives for imposing tariffs against Canada and Mexico. The stated objectives for the United States government is to reduce the amount of drugs and is to encourage the governments of Canada and Mexico to work hard to reduce the levels of drugs, in particular fentanyl, and the illegal immigration that flows from that country into the United States. Anyone who listened to Prime Minister Trudeau's of Canada, Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada's speech today, would have heard him say that indeed less than 1% of the fentanyl and illicit drug traffic into the United States comes from Canada, and that just the level of illegal immigration from Canada is also just as minimal. He suggests that the tariffs are really just the idea of curtailing illicit drug flows and illegal migration flows is a pretext for trying to cripple Canada's economy. And I suspect that President Trump will have a response during his address this evening to the joint session of Congress. However, whichever way you fall into on the debate, what is inarguable is that the underlying reasons for the tariff against China, United States tariffs against imports from China, and United States tariffs against imports from Canada and Mexico are different. Setting aside the broader question of whether tariffs is the better instrument to influence behaviors of a sovereign state, especially when the underlying issue is non-trade related. Moving forward, and as you will recall, we have in a previous class discussed the theory of comparative advantage, which is the ability of a country to produce a good or service at a lower opportunity cost than its trading partners. Comparative advantage is therefore a key principle that explains why countries can benefit from trade. So it's not enough to say that I want us to make X in this country. The question is, do we have comparative advantage in making X, whatever that X is, a widget, let me use the word widget, in making a widget relative to our trading partners? If we don't, it becomes a rational argument to say we are better off importing that widget from that country because they have comparative advantage, so that that country, the labor force in that country, can make enough international sales to be able to consume the goods we make with comparative advantage. And on balance, it becomes a win-win. So that is a logic you might want to consider as you think through the ongoing debates, the economic principle of comparative advantage. Thus, in this way, a misalignment between prices and production due to non-market economic practices can unduly advantage a country over its trading partners, and worse, distort efficiency of markets and create economic inefficiencies in global trading systems. Again, unpacking the argument that is made against Chinese imports of especially Chinese-made electric vehicles. The argument is that the corporations that manufacture these cars enjoy government subsidy that allows them to produce the cars at below market cost. And that when you allow importation of these cars into your market, they crowd out your local manufacturers and render your local manufacturers uncompetitive, their products uncompetitive. Realize that if these were achieved because of basic comparative advantage, that is a separate argument. The argument made by the United States government and other governments is that the Chinese car companies such as BYD, their market advantage is based on non-market economic practices, i.e. subsidies from the Chinese government, and is not due to comparative advantage. And that this non-market economic practice advantages the Chinese car manufacturers over others, and that they also distort efficiency of markets and create economic inefficiencies in the global trading system. Because now for other countries to allow, you could either now place a tariff or begin to subsidize your own industry. And once you begin to do that, you begin to inefficiently allocate resources and realize that resource is a finite commodity. So there is only so much of it that is available at any given time. Of note, two major strains of realism are relevant to the study of international political economy. The first strain, which largely neglects economics, sees little connection between economics and politics. The second strain of realism is more attuned to economic political linkages. Now, this brings us to learning objectives for this week. At the conclusion of this module by Friday, 11:59 p.m., you should be able to explain the following. You have to be able to explain the realistic perspective of international relations, which is that realists view international relations from a competitive and conflictual perspective. It is usually contrasted with idealism or liberalism, which tends to emphasize cooperation. Not all realists, however, deny the presence of ethics in international relations. A distinction should be drawn between classical realism, represented by such 20th century theorists as Reinhold Niebuhr and Hans Morgenthau, and radical or extreme realism. While classical realism emphasizes the concept of national interest, it is not the Machiavellian doctrine that anything is justified by reason of state, nor does it involve the glorification of war or conflict. The classical realists do not reject the possibility of moral judgment in international politics. Rather, they are critical of moralism, abstract moral discourse that does not take into account political realities. Realists believe that sovereign states are the principal actors in the international system. International institutions, non-governmental organizations, multinational corporations, individuals, and other sub-state or trans-state actors are viewed as having little independent influence. This is challenging, as you might imagine, and this is some of what's playing out in the world today, where there is an impulse to regress to the status quo of might makes right, rather than a rules-based international system where all countries adhere to basic rules that govern international relations. The latter, by the way, whose articulation and implementation was led by the United States through several institutions some of which we have covered, including the World Trade Organization, including the United Nations, including the World Bank Group, including the IMF. They set the rules of engagement between countries. Many also, such as whatever you think about the shortcomings of the United Nations Security Council, it at least has the capacity to, such as the ICC, International Criminal Court, also has the capacity to hold actors accountable. So it creates a flat system where, in theory, all countries are held to the same standard. This has created the implementation of these rules to a degree of global stability and peace that the world, and growth, prosperity, that the world has not experienced in the centuries prior. So Even so, the impulse as we now see it is for bigger countries to claim territory, whether it be Russia in Ukraine or China's attempts to annex Taiwan, or some of the rhetoric that has come out of the United States government with respect to Canada and with respect to Greenland, I believe. But again, I suspect that world will soon come back to equilibrium and realize that at the end of it, diplomacy is what resolves conflict. And if you believe in diplomacy, then you're going to need international institutions that can mediate conflict and set the rules and norms for engagement, and which is how we get back to the Bretton Woods institutions and the post-World War II international order. So realists believe that there are no universal principles with which all states may guide their actions. This is obviously in sharp contrast to the liberal order. Instead, realists suggest that a state must always be aware of the actions of the states around it and must use pragmatic approaches to resolve problems as they arise. A lack of certainty regarding intention prompts mistrust and competition between states. However, realism is often criticized as excessively pessimistic, since it sees the confrontational nature of international systems as inevitable. And that is a shortcoming. The second is to describe, learning outcome is to describe the origins and philosophical foundation of the realistic view of international relations. Among its founding fathers, Thucydides, Machiavelli, and Hobbes are the names most usually mentioned. 20th century classical realism has today been largely replaced by neo-realism, which is an attempt to construct a more scientific approach to the study of international relations. Both with classical realism and neo-realism have been subjected to criticism from international relations theorists representing liberal, critical, and postmodern perspectives. It is important to also realize that, and again, this is probably a topic that we're going to need to get into perhaps, if not this class, next week, because I did commit to concluding the lecture in a manner that allows our office hour and the Q&A not to impede our ability to watch the president's speech to the joint session of Congress. So we'll see how that plays out. So the third learning outcome is to explain how realism is connected to economic relations and conflict in global trade. To which you might want to consider that realists see the state as motivated by power with respect to trade. Realists reiterate mercantilist principles, viewing economic statecraft, including trade policies, as one of many instruments available to states in their pursuit of power and national interest. For realists, trade relationships are temporary or transitory arrangements that can be easily broken when conditions necessitate other strategies to secure national interests. Realists do not rule out the utility of force, even against a trade partner, when the national interests are at stake. However, force may be undesirable when the trading partner is of vital national interest. Realists are less optimistic about human nature. They envisage conflict rather than cooperation for the common good to result from self-interested actions. However, each state's pursuit of its own national interest, economic power, and security maximization produces a security dilemma. It is important to note this point because this is the critical shortcoming with the realistic perspective. Consider this. As Each state pursues its own national interest vis-a-vis economic power and security maximization. This produces a security dilemma, which in turn results in greater insecurity and intensifies threat to interstate peace. This is because as a state takes an action to maximize its security or national interest positions, it generates a counter move by other states because now other states have to counter that to protect themselves. This counter leads to what is called a security dilemma, which every action generates a reaction and eventually can result in actions that no state actually wants. And this is the critical shortcoming and challenge of the realistic perspective. And with that, I will conclude the formal lecture section of this week's class. Kindly note that next week, we will cover the critical perspective in international political economy. And with that, I'll end the recording and we will transition into Q&A and office hour. Thank you.